我们从不认为哪一个国家可以充当国际警察，我们也不认同哪一个国家可以自诩为国际法官。各国的主权和安全都应当受到国际法的充分保护。我们一贯反对在国际关系中使用或威胁使用武力，反对将一国的意志强加于别国。中方愿意同包括巴基斯坦在内的国际社会一道，坚定捍卫联合国宪章，坚守国际道义底线，坚持各国主权平等，共同来维护世界的和平与发展，共同来推动构建人类命运的共同体。
I think China has said very strong condemnation of the United States, and they're working with other Latin American and Caribbean countries to say this isn't right. This sets a very dangerous precedent, not just in Latin America, but also throughout the world. What if a president doesn't like what President Trump wants? Does that mean the United States can just kidnap and hold hostage the president, plunder the natural resources? You know, again, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world.
So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
We've taken over another country. Our leader can't even pronounce the word judicious. And I have to say, before I say anything else, that I'm deeply embarrassed to be an American today. Why have we taken over Venezuela? For the oil. We want its oil.
South Africa is calling for an urgent United Nations Security Council meeting following what it calls unilateral military action in Venezuela. Now, the International Relations Department says it views the U.S. strike and the capture of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife as a grave violation of the UN Charter. Pretoria warns that the use of force against a sovereign state undermines international law, political independence and global stability. It is now urging the Security Council to convene immediately to address the situation and to prevent further escalation.
Breaking. Tonight's story is about a major shift that is unfolding on the world stage, and it centers on Venezuela, America's recent military operation in Caracas, which led to the capture of Venezuelan leader. Maduro and his wife was intended to reset U.S. influence in the region. Instead, developments over the past days and weeks hint that the balance of power may be shifting in unexpected directions. What previously looked like a decisive move is now being interpreted by many analysts as a turning point that the United States may have lost influence over Venezuela and that China, Africa, and Caracas itself are now shaping the narrative in ways that could change geopolitics for years to come. Here are the key facts. In early January 2026, U.S. forces carried out a high-profile operation in Venezuela. The operation resulted in Maduro's capture and subsequent indictment in a U.S. federal court on multiple charges. This action drew immediate international attention and triggered widespread diplomatic reactions. Several countries called out the operation as a violation of Venezuela's sovereignty and international law. Comments from representatives at the United Nations described the operation as a serious concern, and many nations emphasized the importance of respecting territorial integrity and the UN Charter. China, which has been a long-term partner of Venezuela in areas such as energy trade and development financing, condemned the operation and demanded Maduro's release. Beijing's foreign ministry stressed its commitment to cooperation with Venezuela and the protection of its investments, even as political circumstances continue to shift. At the same time, financial regulators in China have taken steps to assess exposure to Venezuelan credit risk, highlighting the depth of economic ties between Beijing and Caracas. This connection goes back decades. Venezuela has historically been one of China's largest energy partners in Latin America, and Chinese policy banks have provided significant loans in exchange for oil exports. Those arrangements, while complex, tied Beijing to Caracas financially and strategically long before recent events, reports also show that other countries, including some African states, have expressed concern about unilateral military actions that violate sovereignty norms. This framing places the situation within a larger discussion about how nations assert independence in international affairs. The immediate political implications are already visible. Analysts warn that Venezuela's future governance remains deeply uncertain. With Maduro removed from power, political control in Caracas is contested, and long-term stability is unclear. U.S. officials have stated intentions to oversee an orderly transition, but without a clear timeline or mechanism for how domestic actors and international partners would be involved, ambiguity persists. From the U.S. perspective, capturing Maduro was framed as a necessary step for justice and accountability. Yet critics argue that sidelining diplomatic options and focusing on military action has weakened America's broader standing among nations that preferred dialogue, respect for sovereignty, and multilateral engagement. This could mean that Washington's influence in Latin America is being viewed differently by regional partners than it was in the past. In contrast, China's involvement in Venezuela paints a picture of long-term economic and diplomatic engagement. Beijing's emphasis on protecting its investments and continuing cooperation with Venezuela demonstrates a different approach, one focused on economic integration and mutual benefit rather than direct intervention. This contrast is clear in statements from Chinese officials underscoring lawful engagement and a commitment to the relationship even as political tides turn. African countries have also been part of the broader discourse. Some governments have emphasized respect for sovereignty and international law, positioning themselves as advocates for multilateral processes. This connects to Africa's growing presence in global diplomacy, where many nations seek to assert their interests outside traditional power structures. When we step back and look at these developments together, several broader implications emerge. First, analysts warn that U.S. unilateral actions, even when justified as law enforcement, can weaken America's ability to lead on broader global issues. When partners see deep respect for sovereignty as a priority, overt military intervention can complicate diplomatic relationships. Second, the strength of Venezuelan relationships with China and other partners reveals that influence is not solely determined by military power. Long-term economic ties, infrastructure projects, and energy agreements have created a foundation that can withstand significant political shocks. While Venezuela's internal situation remains fragile, these economic connections give Beijing and other partners leverage and staying power. Third, this could mean a growing acceptance of multipolar influence in regions that were once viewed as within a single power sphere. America's actions in Venezuela have triggered criticism from nations including France, Russia, Brazil, and Mexico, who emphasized that international law should govern state interactions. This convergence of voices points to a world where alliances are not fixed and where diverse coalitions can shape outcomes based on shared principles, rather than historical hierarchies. Some observers also point out that Venezuela's vast oil reserves and other natural resources remain central to this broader repositioning. While the U.S. seeks to manage those assets for economic benefit, China's long-standing access and investment efforts may yet give it an advantage as markets adjust. This could have implications for global energy flows and for how major powers negotiate with resource-rich countries in the future. For Africa, growing engagement with Venezuela and other global partners underscores a shift toward diversified diplomacy. African nations have shown increasing interest in assertive foreign policies that emphasize sovereignty and equitable partnerships. This could mean more balanced relationships that do not automatically align with a single major power, but instead reflect a broader set of economic and political interests. There are real risks in this environment of shifting influence. If political uncertainty persists in Venezuela, instability could spill over into neighboring countries, affecting migration patterns, trade routes, and regional security. Analysts warn that without inclusive political solutions in Caracas, tensions could remain elevated, affecting not just Venezuela but the wider region. Yet there are also opportunities. Multipolar engagement can encourage more inclusive development strategies, where countries work together on infrastructure, trade, energy, and governance. When nations emphasize diplomatic engagement over confrontation, long-term relationships can be built on transparency and mutual respect. The capture of Venezuela's leader is one of the most dramatic events in recent hemispheric history, but its meaning continues to evolve, not only for Washington and Caracas, but for Beijing, African capitals, and diplomatic capitals around the world. The initial narrative of a decisive American action has become more complex as global actors assert their own interests and frameworks. This could mean that the future of Venezuela will be shaped not by a single influence but by competing visions of economic cooperation, political sovereignty, and global balance. And as these forces interact, the assumptions about where power truly lies in the 21st century are being tested. So as we watch this chapter unfold, here is a question for you, our audience. In a world where multiple powers are asserting influence, how should countries like Venezuela balance national sovereignty with the interests of larger global partners? As the story deepens, what is happening around Venezuela is no longer just about diplomacy or headlines. It is about power, leverage, and who gets to shape the future of global trade and influence. When China and several African nations increased their engagement with Caracas, it sent a message that went far beyond Latin America. It showed that Venezuela is no longer isolated in the way many once believed, and that the global balance around the country is shifting quietly but steadily. For years, Venezuela struggled under economic pressure, reduced access to global markets, and declining oil production. Inflation soared, shortages became common, and millions left the country in search of stability. But over time, the situation began to change. Oil production slowly recovered, alternative trade routes opened, new buyers stepped in, and now Venezuela appears to be repositioning itself in a world that is no longer dominated by one single economic center. China's involvement is a major part of this change. Chinese companies expanded energy cooperation, infrastructure support, and financial arrangements that bypass traditional systems. Payments increasingly avoided the dollar. Oil shipments moved under new contracts. Logistics were reorganized. Analysts warn this could mean Venezuela is becoming a testing ground for a new kind of trade model, one that relies less on Western institutions and more on bilateral agreements and regional partnerships. Africa's role is just as important, even if it receives less attention. Several African economies, facing rising food and energy costs, began looking for partners outside their traditional suppliers. Venezuela, rich in oil and agricultural potential, became attractive. Trade discussions focused on fuel for food arrangements, technology exchanges, and joint development projects. This could mean African nations are not only diversifying their supply chains but also strengthening South-to-South cooperation in ways that were once rare. The United States, meanwhile, finds itself watching these developments from a difficult position. Sanctions limited direct engagement, while other global players filled the gap. This did not happen overnight. It happened step by step, deal by deal, shipment by shipment, and now the cumulative effect is becoming visible. Venezuela is no longer waiting to be reintegrated on Western terms. It is building alternatives. Economically, this shift matters. Venezuela holds some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Access to that energy has global implications, especially as markets remain volatile. When new buyers secure long-term supply agreements, it reshapes pricing power and influence. Analysts warn this could mean less leverage for countries that once relied on controlling access to global financial systems to enforce policy goals. Politically, the change is even more complex. By strengthening ties with China and African partners, Venezuela is signaling that it sees its future in a multipolar world. This does not mean alliances are fixed or permanent, but it does suggest a clear direction. Countries that feel pressured or constrained by existing global rules are increasingly willing to test new paths. Inside Venezuela, these developments are being felt in mixed ways. Some industries show signs of recovery. Oil workers report increased activity. Ports are busier than they were a few years ago, but challenges remain. Inflation is still a concern. Wages are low. Public services are under strain. The new partnerships bring opportunity, but they do not solve deep structural problems overnight. For African nations, cooperation with Venezuela also carries risks. Logistics are complex, political uncertainty remains, energy projects require long-term stability. Yet many leaders see these risks as acceptable compared to the vulnerabilities of relying on a narrow group of suppliers. Diversification, they argue, is not just economic strategy but economic survival. China, on the other hand, appears to be playing a longer game. By investing during difficult periods, it secures influence and access. When conditions improve, this approach has been used in other regions, and Venezuela fits that pattern. Analysts warn this could mean China's footprint in Latin America will continue to grow, challenging traditional power dynamics in the region. Globally, this situation reflects a larger trend. The world economy is fragmenting into overlapping networks rather than a single, unified system. Countries are choosing partners based on immediate needs rather than ideological alignment. Energy, food, and security concerns are driving decisions more than political labels. This could mean the concept of isolation itself is changing. In the past, losing access to Western markets often meant economic collapse. Today, alternative markets exist. They may be less efficient, more complex, or more risky, but they are real. Venezuela's experience shows how a country under pressure can adapt, even if imperfectly. For the United States, this moment raises difficult questions. Should pressure strategies be adjusted in a world where alternatives are Expanding? How should policymakers respond when influence declines not through confrontation but through quiet realignment? Analysts warn that ignoring these shifts could lead to further loss of strategic ground. For Europe, the situation also matters. Energy security remains fragile, and competition for resources is intense. If Venezuela's oil increasingly flows east and south, it reduces options elsewhere. This could mean higher costs, tougher negotiations, and greater dependence on fewer suppliers. As this story continues, one thing is clear. Venezuela is no longer standing alone. Its partnerships with China and Africa are reshaping how the country fits into the global system. This shift may not be dramatic on the surface, but its long-term impact could be profound. The question now is not just who gains or loses influence, but how the rules of global engagement are changing. If countries like Venezuela can rebuild connections outside traditional frameworks, what does that mean for the future of sanctions, alliances, and global power itself?